Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Vancouver Kingsway.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when the Liberals promised Canadians cannabis legalization last election, I think that reasonable Canadians understood legalization to mean the end of criminalization, the end of stigmatization, and the end of the prohibitionist approach to cannabis. That's why I, along with millions of other Canadians, was somewhat surprised to read the fine print of Bill C-45, only to discover that this isn't legalization at all. It's just making cannabis less illegal. This legislation creates a litany of new cannabis-related criminal offences, most of which carry a maximum sentence of up to 14 years in prison. As renowned criminal defence attorney Michael Spratt put it, Bill C-45 is an unnecessarily complex piece of legislation that leaves intact the criminalization of marijuana in too many circumstances. An adult who possesses 30 grams of marijuana in public is a criminal. A youth who possesses more than 5 grams of marijuana is a criminal. An 18-year-old who passes a joint to their 17-year-old friend is a criminal. An adult who grows 5 marijuana plants is a criminal. This continued criminalization is inconsistent with a rational and evidence-based criminal justice policy and will only serve to reduce the positive impacts of the bill, end quote. Now, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Health has claimed that these harsh penalties are reserved for, quote, some gangster in a stairwell, end quote, selling cannabis to children. But this is exactly the sort of reefer madness rhetoric that has fueled prohibition for nearly a century. The evidence before the Health Committee was directly contrary to this view. In fact, 95% of cannabis producers and consumers in this country are nonviolent, law-abiding citizens who have nothing to do with organized crime whatsoever. Indeed, if criminalization and the threat of imprisonment prevented people from using cannabis, then Canadians wouldn't be consuming an estimated 655 metric tons of it every year, when we have full criminalization and life sentences for trafficking. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, the prohibitionist approach has been repeatedly discredited by its failures throughout history. Cannabis consumption has increased steadily throughout the so-called war on drugs, and Canadian youth consume cannabis at some of the highest rates in the world today. Of the 4.6 million people the Parliamentary Budget Officer projects will use cannabis at least once in 2018, nearly 1.7 million, or more than one-third, would be in the 15 to 24 age group. And for far too long, we've wasted billions of dollars in resources in the criminal justice system by criminalizing otherwise law-abiding citizens at an alarming rate for simply processing and consuming cannabis. In fact, Mr. Speaker, we still are. According to Statistics Canada, in 2016, under the Liberal government, after they promised Canadians legalization, the most recent year of available data, there were 55,000 offences related to cannabis reported to police, and police charged 17,733 people with pot possession. Given that cannabis possession will soon be made legal in Canada, the NDP has been clear from the outset that we should immediately decriminalize the possession of recreational cannabis for personal use pending full legalization. Now, petty possession is a crime that the Prime Minister himself has admitted to committing while serving as an elected official. This admission of past cannabis use belies his repeated assertion that, quote, until we've changed the law, the current laws exist and apply, end quote. I guess he meant they apply to other people, not to him. Now, it is a shame and hypocrisy of the highest order that this government continues to prosecute and convict Canadians for simple cannabis possession, something the government admits should be legal. Mr. Speaker, this government knows full well that current cannabis laws aren't applied consistently across this country. Indeed, their discriminatory impact has been well documented by Canadian researchers like Simon Fraser University's Dr. Neil Boyd. Furthermore, Given the extensive body of research on the negative impacts of carrying a criminal record, it's clear that pursuing thousands of convictions for an act that we no longer view as criminal will needlessly harm vulnerable Canadians, particularly young people, racialized communities, Indigenous people, and other marginalized groups, mainly the poor. Now, Mr. Speaker, I want to be clear that because I support genuine cannabis legalization, I acknowledge that Bill C-45 is an improvement on the status quo. That's why Canada's New Democrats will support this legislation. This bill allows for the legal possession of up to 30 grams of cannabis. It permits the legal cultivation of up to 4 cannabis plants per dwelling house. And it creates a framework for the development of a legal recreational cannabis industry in Canada. I must note, however, that inexplicably, Bill C-45 allows the provinces and territories to derogate from these basic freedoms. This should be a major concern to anyone who wants genuine cannabis legalization in Canada and those who are urging this House to rush this legislation through. Mr. Speaker, I also want the record to show that after we revealed gaping holes in the Liberal government's cannabis legislation, the NDP worked in the best spirits of Jack Layton to reach across the aisle in order to give Canadians what they actually voted for, genuine cannabis legalization. And for anyone who doubts the positive role that an effective opposition can play, I'll point out that we were able to convince the Liberals to do the following: drop the ridiculous 100-centimetre plant height limit that was belied by all evidence and the experts, bring in edibles and concentrates, albeit not immediately but within a year, and recognize the necessity of craft cannabis growers being brought into the legalized production framework. Mr. Speaker, mark my words, these improvements would not have happened had the New Democrats not diligently been working at committee to bring forth the witnesses and evidence and push this government to do the right thing. And I will give the government credit. Unlike the previous Conservative government, which hardly ever took any suggestions from this side of the House, the Liberal government has proven an ability to listen to the evidence and make moves, albeit not as far as we would like. Now, in addition, at the Health Committee, we put forward 38 practical amendments to fully align Bill C-45 with its purposes section and with the evidence we heard from expert testimony. Now, the purposes are and include bringing the illicit industry into the light, to make sure Canadians have access to safe, well-regulated cannabis products, to take the production and distribution of cannabis out of the hands of organized crime and bring it into the regulated legal industry. That's what the New Democrats paid attention to when we moved our amendments to make sure this legislation aligned with that. Unfortunately, the Liberal government has refused to do that in all cases, edibles being the most notable example, where this government is content to leave edibles and concentrates in the hands of the black market, in the hands of organized crime, totally unregulated, for up to another year and a half, 2 years from now. They can't explain why. Now, our proposed changes included, besides legalizing the sale of edibles and concentrates, providing pardons to Canadians saddled with a criminal record for offences that will no longer be offences under Bill C-45. Now, this amendment was ruled outside the scope of Bill C-45. But given the Prime Minister's previous statements, it's rather shocking that the Liberal government would structure a cannabis legalization bill in such a way that pardons cannot be included through amendment as being outside the scope of the consideration of the bill. So when the Liberals say they've taken their time, they've consulted widely, maybe they can explain to Canadians how after 2 years they somehow forgot to deal with the issue of pardons that Canadians carry in this country when they know how devastating the effect criminal convictions for cannabis have on people's economic and social lives. We've also brought in amendments to empower provincial governments to create parallel production licensing regimes in order to give provinces the flexibility to implement legalization in the manner best suited to their jurisdiction. For example, this would have allowed provinces to let craft growers, small-scale producers, and outdoor growers, artisanal growers, compete against large federally licensed corporate entities. That was voted down by the Liberals. We proposed to decriminalize the penalty section in line with the Tobacco Act. We propose that this legalization should take a regulatory approach with significant fines for offences rather than criminal ones. One of the purposes of Bill C-45, as laid out in Section 7, is to, quote, reduce the burden on the criminal justice system in relation to cannabis, end quote. Well, penalties in this bill, in the NDP's view, should be consistent with that stated intent. Now, with the Liberal government's rejection of these amendments, I am very concerned that C-45 will continue to harm many Canadians, and that's after it becomes law in this country. Unconscionable prison sentences, arbitrary possession limits, and barriers to small craft and artisanal producers are just a few of the damaging provisions that do need to be corrected. I am heartened, however, that this bill at least contains a mandatory review of C-45's operation in the next Parliament. I view this as a tacit admission by the government that they know that this bill contains problematic sections that will need to be fixed. In fact, it was a Liberal amendment to move the review from 5 years to 3 years. I think the Liberals know that this bill has flaws that need to be fixed. Truthfully, I'd prefer to get it right the first time around. As it currently stands, the federal government has left the heavy lifting of legalization to the provincial, territorial, municipal, and Indigenous governments. Now, the task force on cannabis legalization was very clear in the lead up to legalization that the federal government should, quote, take a leadership role to ensure that capacity is developed among all levels of government prior to the start of the regulatory regime, end quote. And yet, when asked if the federal government had even been talking with First Nations and Indigenous governments on a nation-to-nation basis to ensure that capacity was developed, Ontario Regional Chief Isidore Day told the Health Committee, quote, no, they haven't. And again, it's going to be really critical. Now, by freezing out stakeholders and insisting on meeting an arbitrary, politically motivated deadline, this government is clearly sacrificing quality legislation for speed. Now, this has led to the emergence of a patchwork of different approaches to cannabis across Canada that will likely be complex and varied and will put many Canadians in the position, perhaps, of breaking the law unintentionally. For example, some provinces may not allow any home growing. In fact, Quebec just announced this very measure. Some provinces may choose to lower the public possession limit from 30 grams. Some provinces may forbid public consumption. Some municipalities may ban cannabis sales and consumption completely. I want to be clear to any Canadians watching this. The Liberals put forth legislation that allows the provinces to actually deviate from being allowed to grow 4 plants at home, to deviate from being legally able to carry 30 grams of cannabis in public. So when those that are searching and waiting, as they've waited for decades and decades for cannabis legalization, want this bill to be passed, they should be aware that federal leadership for a national legalized structure for cannabis is not going to be delivered by this bill, and we see that already, as I've mentioned with the Quebec example, where you will not be able to grow plants at home in Quebec. I don't think that's what cannabis advocates have been working for all these years. Now, the Liberals' recent attempt to unilaterally impose an excise tax without consulting other jurisdictions directly contradicted the recommendations of the McClellan report. And the Liberals' attempt to keep half of the excise tax revenues at the federal level ignores the fact that the bulk of expenses related to legalization will fall to the provincial, territorial, and municipal levels. For our part, Canada's New Democrats will continue to reach across the aisle to help ensure that legalization is done right and on time. Ever since the Liberal government of the day ignored the recommendations of the 1971 Ledane Commission, our party, the New Democrats, have been calling on successive governments to stop saddling Canadians with criminal records for using cannabis. We strongly believe and continue to maintain that these unjustifiable arrests must end as soon as possible. Now, Mr. Speaker, I would be remiss not to use this occasion to outline some simple truths about cannabis that I fear are far too often drowned out of the public discussion by prohibitionist fear-mongering. Number one, in almost all contexts, alcohol and tobacco are far more personally and socially harmful than cannabis. Cannabis doesn't make you aggressive, you cannot fatally overdose on cannabis, and cannabis isn't a carcinogen. We heard this point repeated over and over and over again by experts at the Health Committee. Number two, cannabis has a broad range of therapeutic benefits. It's used as an effective medicine by Canadian patients suffering from conditions ranging from epilepsy to PTSD, from cancer to arthritis. I believe that if this point were properly understood by the Liberals, then they wouldn't have recently announced a plan without consulting patients to impose a new excise tax of $1 per gram on medicinal cannabis, or 10% of the final retail price, whichever is higher. At the end of 2016, there were 129,876 Canadian patients with physician authorization to use medicinal cannabis. And since the first Canadian veteran was reimbursed on compassionate grounds in 2007, Veterans Affairs Canada now covers the cost of medicinal cannabis for over 3,000 Canadian veterans, yet this government wants to tax them. Shockingly, however, the federal government does not cover medicinal cannabis for Indigenous people, a discriminatory policy that puts the lie to the Prime Minister's claim that his most important relationship is with Indigenous communities. Mr. Speaker, the Liberals' medicinal cannabis tax is misconceived, unfair to patients, and damaging to public health. It is simply poor public policy. Now, the cost burden of medicinal cannabis is already high, given that, unlike prescription drugs and medically necessary devices, it is not tax-exempt under federal law. Medicinal cannabis is neither exempt from the GST nor eligible for reimbursement under nearly all public or private insurance plans. So patients are currently forced to spend hundreds or thousands of dollars each month in order to acquire a sufficient supply of medicinal cannabis, or choose a riskier option, perhaps like a prescription opioid, because it's tax-exempt and covered for reimbursement. That's perverse. Medicinal cannabis should be treated like other medically prescribed therapeutic medicines. And looking forward, New Democrats will use every tool at our disposal to scrap that flawed policy decision. Now, third, just yesterday in this House, the Conservative member for Thornhill told Canadians that legal cannabis is, quote, just as dangerous as fentanyl, end quote, and that homegrown cannabis, quote, is virtually the same as putting fentanyl on a shelf within reach of kids. This is an outrageous and dangerous falsehood, and grossly insensitive to those who have lost loved ones to fentanyl overdoses. Trying to capitalize on their personal tragedies for political purposes is shameful, callous, and unsupportable. I call on the Conservative Party to correct the record, and for that member to offer a sincere apology to every Canadian who has been affected by the fentanyl crisis. Which brings me to truth number 4. Cannabis and cannabis concentrates have been consumed by humans for thousands of years without bringing about the alarmist predictions peddled by prohibitionists. Cannabis is not a carcinogen. Lethal overdoses from cannabis and cannabinoids do not occur. And cannabis can be used to reduce anxiety and enhance enjoyment of many activities. Much like unwinding with a glass of wine, millions of adult Canadians find occasional cannabis consumption a relaxing and pleasurable way to spend their free time. Ultimately, Mr. Speaker, I have come to understand that a genuinely legalized and properly regulated cannabis industry in Canada has enormous potential in many respects. Done right, an appropriate legal approach can achieve impressive benefits economically, technologically, and medicinally. It can advance Canada's cannabis producers, retailers, and innovators on a global scale. It can generate world-leading intellectual property, innovation, and sustainable development benefits. And it can help establish an evidence-based understanding of cannabis that has been so marred by decades of misinformation and mythology. At the very time that many other jurisdictions are also grappling with the failures of prohibition, why on earth would we preemptively cut ourselves off at the knees by legally prohibiting cannabis exports to markets where it would be legal to import it? And yet, Bill C-45 explicitly prohibits all importation and exportation of recreational cannabis. Now, the world is rapidly waking up to the potential of safe, regulated, and legal cannabis products. Countries like France, the Czech Republic, Belgium, Italy, Luxembourg, Malta, Slovenia look to re-examine their approaches to cannabis, and Canada should be establishing itself as a first-to-market world leader. While the U.S. cannabis industry continues to be hindered by the Trump administration's reefer madness thinking about cannabis, Canada should be taking advantage by empowering our entrepreneurs and developing export markets all around the world. Mr. Speaker, millions of Canadians use cannabis. They've used it in the past, they'll use it today, and they'll continue to use it in the years to come. They are not criminals. They are our parents, teachers, friends, colleagues, loved ones, and citizens of this great country who voted for genuine cannabis legalization in the last election, the NDP will continue to work positively and constructively to develop the smartest, safest, and most effective cannabis legislation and regulations in the world, because it's time we delivered.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Winnipeg North.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And, you know, I appreciate, first and foremost, the NDP are going to be supporting the legislation. This legislation that we have before us today was not easily achieved. There was a great deal of consultation and working with whether it's first responders, many different stakeholders, provinces, many interested groups that had so much to say. And I believe that we have, I would ultimately argue, the best legislation that is, quite frankly, possible at this point in advancing and doing what Canadians expect. And it is a commitment that was given by this Prime Minister in the last election. So it is, in fact, fulfilling, in a very tangible way, an election platform. Now, I listened to my colleague from across the way, and as I say, I appreciate the fact that they are going to be supporting the legislation, but he seemed to emphasize a great deal of attention on, well, we could have done so much more. He spent a lot of time, Mr. Speaker, as you heard, talking about decriminalization and how important that was, and how he was being somewhat critical of the government for not decriminalizing. I know they have a new leader in Jagmeet Singh, and Jagmeet is saying that we should have decriminalization of all illegal drugs. And I'm wondering if, in fact, that same principle or that same eagerness that the member across the way is saying that we should decriminalize, is that something in which the NDP today are advocating for, what their new leader is saying, and that is to decriminalize all illegal drugs?
Well, member for Vancouver Kingsway.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The member said a lot there. I'd like to start with some of his early points, that I thought it was the purpose of members of Parliament, and we're sent here by constituents, to try to make legislation better. That's what we've tried to do, and in fact, we've done that. You know, when the Liberals first tabled their legislation in the House, it banned edibles. It had a 100-centimetre limit on plant growth. It doesn't deal at all with pardons. It was very unclear whether small craft artisanal producers in this country would be able to participate in the legalized industry. And the NDP rolled up our sleeves, and we called evidence so that we could work on the government and show them that that legislation was wrong and deficient in those respects. And in fact, we got the government to change their minds on those. There are still other flaws in this bill, however. And that's why the NDP will continue to be advocating positive steps. It's a good bill. It could be better. After 100 years of criminalization of cannabis, I think that we can spend a few months trying to make sure that this legislation works. And again, one of the NDP's primary purposes was to make this legislation align with the purposes of the Act. And there's several examples in this Act where the legislation does not do that. I would point out one thing when my honourable colleague talks about consultation. You know, just because you say it doesn't make it true. The NDP put forth a motion at committee to hear from stakeholders that had not been heard from, licensed producers, dispensary owners, young Canadians, and yet the Liberals voted that down. They did not want us to hear from those groups. So when he says that they've consulted widely, maybe he can explain to this House and Canadians why they didn't want to hear from those groups when they actually didn't have a chance to have their perspective on legislation heard at committee in the Liberals' rush to get the committee process done in 5 days.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The member just said that just because you say it doesn't make it true. And he's right about that. Now, that member told us that apparently there's no association between use of marijuana and a more violent state. I want to read to him from, this is Chronic Toxicology of Cannabis is the name of the article. It's not a newspaper article. It actually appeared in Clinical Toxicology. It was written by someone at the medical school at the University of Queensland. He writes, several studies from diverse cultures have confirmed the elevated risk of psychosis and schizophrenia spectrum disorders following high levels of cannabis use, particularly when cannabis consumption has commenced at a young age. He says later on, although the psychoneurological effects of cannabis are usually stereotypically characterized as a depressant, both its use and the withdrawal state are accompanied frequently by psychomotor agitation, which has been implicated causally with interpersonal violence. Interestingly, in a series of forensic examinations of suicide, cannabis use was associated with the most violent means of death, particularly severe motor vehicle accidents. I'd like to know if the member thinks that the authors of this study at the medical school at the University of Queensland are falling prey to reefer madness.
The honourable member for Vancouver Kingsway.
Well, I had the benefit of sitting through over 90 witnesses at the Health Committee that were drawn from a wide variety of disciplines, including people from Colorado, Washington State, who have experience with legalization, and many academics and professors. And it's quite clear that the health effects of cannabis are, without any doubt whatsoever, far superior to those around tobacco and alcohol. I haven't heard any, my friends on the Conservative side of this House, talk about restricting the amount of alcohol that that someone can purchase when they go to the liquor store. Perhaps it's because they're afraid to take on the alcohol lobby in this country. We heard actually some very graphic testimony that a person can walk into a liquor store and come out with a 26-ounce bottle of liquor, and there's enough alcohol in that bottle to kill an adult. But there's no limits on how many bottles of alcohol someone can walk out of the house on that. With tobacco, of course, is a carcinogen. The Conservatives are opposed to plain packaging for tobacco, and a policy I laud the Liberal government for pursuing in this House and long overdue. Why didn't the Conservatives, after 10 years, pursue plain packaging on tobacco when it's a carcinogen that's addictive and kills our children? I'm not so sure why they would do that. But I will say this, in answer to this question, the research is overwhelming that cannabis is a relatively benign substance. It does have some health impacts that need to be studied for sure. But in terms of what he's talking about, there's a great question about causation versus correlation. We don't know if young people that use cannabis at a young age and develop psychosis, whether they develop psychosis as a result of cannabis use or whether they're seeking to use cannabis use as a way of dealing with their psychosis. So the correlation causation aspect does have to be researched, and I'm looking forward to a lot of money being put into this by this government into researching the effects of cannabis in the years ahead.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Kootenay, Columbia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I would really like to thank my colleague for his great speech and the fact that he truly does work hard every day for middle class and those who are seeking to become part of the middle class. You know, my riding of Kootenay, Columbia has a very interested clientele around the use of cannabis, including a long history of actually being involved in the industry in a number of different ways. They were interested enough that when I held a telephone town hall, 3,300 people stayed on the phone for an hour to listen to the experts that we had in place, and that was followed up by a whole series of questions, which I did send to the Minister of Health and the Minister of Justice. They did provide answers, and we now have a very good report available to my constituents by contacting my office. But there were some things that were not answered, and I'd like to ask my colleague whether during the testimony he heard anything around, because one of the concerns of my constituents was crossing the border into the United States, and I live in a constituency, a riding that borders the United States, and we go back and forth on a regular basis. So whether he's heard anything that the government plans to do to try and alleviate their concerns about either having to lie at the border or being refused from entry into the United States, and whether there are any other of the 38 recommendations that were put forward that the government rejected that he'd like to highlight.
The honourable member for Vancouver Kingsway.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the NDP did point out early on, after hearing testimony of the difficulty that some people had entering the United States when asked by border guards if they'd ever used cannabis, and answered affirmatively, even though they had used the cannabis legally in Washington State and Colorado, they were denied entry to the U.S., which led to a concern by the NDP that this government should be negotiating at least attempting to negotiate with the Trump administration some form of agreement to recognize the reality that cannabis will be legal in Canada, and we don't want to subject Canadians to being turned away at the border or being compelled to lie. The answer we got, unfortunately, was unsatisfactory. It appears that the government has not been entering into those negotiations, and there's a real concern that after July 1, 2018, Canadians will be vulnerable in that respect. I want to end on a bit of a positive note by saying, you know, economically, Canada has a chance to be a global leader in producing safe, quality cannabis products. We're not the only country in the world that's going to legalize. Other countries are going to do it too. And we have, this is a classic industry that is sustainable, high-tech, innovative, green. You can turn a $5 seed into $1,000 worth of product, and Canadians are global leaders. And that's why we're so adamant that the ban on importation exportation in Bill C-45 should be changed to give our Canadian businesses a chance to tap into that market, which could provide billions and billions of dollars of economic activity once other countries do as Canada does, and we abandon the old prohibitionist view of conservative parties around the world.
Reprise du débat, l'honorable